In the late summer of 1944, the Allied armies stood on the edge of what many believed would be the final collapse of Nazi Germany in Western Europe. After the breakout from Normandy, American, British, and Canadian forces surged across France at a speed that stunned even their own commanders. German units were shattered, retreating east in disarray. Roads were clogged with abandoned vehicles, burned tanks, and exhausted soldiers trying to escape encirclement. To many on the ground, it felt as though the war could be ended before the year was out. Yet beneath this rapid advance lay a fragile reality that few civilians understood and many soldiers would pay for. The Allied supply system was breaking down. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American 1st Army and later the 12th Army Group, faced a problem no victorious commander wants to confront. His armies were advancing faster than their supplies could follow. The beaches of Normandy, never designed to support millions of men deep inland, were still the primary supply points. Railroads had been destroyed by Allied bombing. Ports that could have eased the burden, such as Antwerp, remained unusable due to political and strategic delays. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration box had to be hauled forward by truck over hundreds of miles. This logistical strain forced Bradley and Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower to make choices that would shape the rest of the war in Europe. At the center of those choices was a hard decision. Supplies were limited, and not every army could be supported equally. Bradley chose to prioritize certain fronts over others, cutting supplies to the 1st Army and redirecting them elsewhere. On paper, the decision appeared rational. Allied doctrine favored a broad front advance, pushing evenly along the entire line to prevent German counterattacks and deny the enemy time to regroup. Eisenhower supported this approach, believing it minimized risk and maintained coalition unity. But in practice, the redistribution of supplies slowed critical offensives, stalled momentum, and allowed German forces precious time to recover. For soldiers at the front, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Fuel shortages meant armored units sat idle while German forces slipped away. Artillery units rationed shells, unable to provide the overwhelming firepower that had become the American Army's greatest advantage. Infantry units attacked well-prepared defenses without adequate support, suffering casualties that might otherwise have been avoided. The men who had raced across France now found themselves fighting costly battles for small villages, forests, and river crossings that should have been bypassed or overwhelmed. The decision to limit supplies became especially significant as the Allies approached Germany's western defenses. The Siegfried Line, a system of bunkers, dragon's teeth, and fortified positions, awaited them. Breaking through such defenses required massive concentrations of men and materiel. Yet American units often went into these battles under strength and undersupplied. Attacks bogged down, casualties mounted. What had once felt like a race to victory turned into a grinding war of attrition. Bradley's critics, both during the war and after, argued that this was a failure of vision. They believed that concentrating supplies behind a single, decisive thrust could have shattered German resistance before it fully recovered. They pointed to commanders who advocated bold, deep advances, arguing that speed and shock were more important than caution. From this perspective, cutting supplies to active fronts was not merely a logistical necessity, but a strategic error that squandered a fleeting opportunity. Defenders of Bradley countered that the situation was far more complex. The Allied coalition depended on cooperation between nations with different priorities, personalities, and political pressures. Favoring one commander too strongly risked resentment and disunity. Moreover, a narrow thrust, if it failed, could have left Allied forces dangerously exposed. Bradley and Eisenhower feared repeating the mistakes of earlier wars, where overextended armies were cut off and destroyed. Their cautious approach, they believed, protected the long-term success of the campaign, even if it came at a terrible cost. That cost would become painfully clear in the autumn and winter of 1944. As American forces struggled through the Huichin forest, assaulted fortified cities like Aachen, and fought to cross major rivers, casualty lists grew longer. Thousands of young men were wounded or killed in battles that dragged on for weeks. German units, though weakened, fought with determination, using terrain and fortifications to offset Allied numerical superiority. Every delay allowed them to reinforce positions, rotate units, and plan counterattacks. The most devastating consequence of the slowed Allied advance came in December 1944, when German forces launched their surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes. Later known as the Battle of the Bulge. Many historians argue that this attack was only possible because German armies had been given time to regroup. Had the Allies maintained their momentum and applied overwhelming pressure earlier, the Germans might never have been able to assemble the forces needed for such an offensive. Instead, American units, stretched thin and exhausted, faced one of the bloodiest battles in U.S. military history. During the Bulge, supply shortages once again plagued American forces. Units ran low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies in freezing conditions. Entire regiments were encircled, fighting desperately to hold out until relief arrived. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of American soldiers became casualties in just a few weeks, many of them victims not only of enemy fire, but of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. For families back home, telegrams arrived with devastating regularity, each one a reminder that the war was far from over. When the war finally ended in Europe in May 1945, victory came with mixed emotions. Nazi Germany had been defeated, but the price had been enormous. More than 80,000 American casualties can be linked, directly or indirectly, to the prolonged fighting that followed the Allied supply decisions of late 1944. While no single choice can be blamed for every loss, the decision to cut and redistribute supplies stands as a symbol of the difficult trade-offs that define modern warfare. In the years after the war, Bradley reflected on his command with a mix of pride and regret. He defended his choices as necessary under the circumstances, shaped by logistical realities and coalition politics. Yet he also acknowledged the terrible human cost of the campaign. The men who fought under his command paid for every mile gained with blood, and many wondered whether different decisions might have spared some of those lives. The story of Bradley's supply decision is not one of simple right or wrong. It is a reminder that war is fought not only with bullets and tanks, but with fuel, food, and time. Strategic choices made far from the front lines can determine whether soldiers advance swiftly or die inch by inch. In 1944, as victory seemed within reach, the limits of logistics forced Allied commanders to slow their push, turning a potential rout into a prolonged struggle. For the soldiers who endured that struggle, the reasons mattered less than the reality they faced. They fought in muddy fields, dark forests, and frozen hills, often without knowing why help did not arrive sooner or why the enemy still stood before them. Their sacrifices ensured eventual victory, but the cost was measured in lives forever changed or lost. Today, historians continue to debate whether a different approach could have ended the war sooner and with fewer casualties. What remains undeniable is that the decision to cut supplies reshaped the final year of the war in Europe. It altered the pace of the advance, prolonged the fighting, and contributed to one of the highest casualty tolls the United States would ever suffer in a single campaign. It stands as a sobering lesson in the power of logistics and the heavy burden carried by those who make decisions in war, decisions whose consequences are written not in maps or orders, but in the lives of soldiers on the battlefield.